Yeah.
We're almost at the start time, everybody. So if you're just joining us, we're just shooting the breeze right now. We're giving everyone else a chance to get in. We're gonna have Bob start his presentation in just a bit, but we do want to give some other people time to join the call this morning. We thank you guys for showing up today. We hope the convention is going well so far. We've had a series of competitions already, Bob. We've had what's called the Crazy Eights, and students had 8 hours to produce some sort of creative thing, whether it's a podcast or a short film or a news magazine. So that ran yesterday. And even though we're doing it remotely, the excitement is still there. There's that everyone's huddled around the computer waiting for it to export and upload, and the excitement's still there. So that's been great to see.
Well, they are now where I was a lifetime ago. I mean, I love the fact that they had deadlines and challenges and problems, because I always did better when I was up against it.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody says, "Oh, you got all the time in the world to do it," you go, "Okay, maybe I'll get to it sometime."
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, you remember Apollo 13? It was trying to come back into the atmosphere and about ready to burn up.
Yeah.
And all the great scientists were sitting around saying, "Boy, we need a blow up, feed up connector and this, that, and the other." And finally, the boss said, "Listen, all they have is a roll of toilet paper and a plunger." And everybody goes, "Okay, I get the metaphor.
Yeah.
Let's see what we can do with just two things."
With just that.
And go. And that to me is the essence of storytelling, trying to figure out what building blocks you're going to need in the time that you have, and then off you go to the races. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So for everybody just join us, it is 9:00. Well, on my side in Hawaii, it's 9 a.m. But in the Pacific, it's 11, and that's when we're supposed to get started. So we are going to get started this morning. Let me just take a few moments to give everybody just, I guess, some housekeeping kinds of things. Not house cleaning. We're not cleaning anything. Housekeeping. We do have, this is a Zoom webinar. So right now, everyone's cameras and microphones are turned off. If you have a question, we do have a Q&A section, and I'm hoping that you guys can see that. There is a Q&A tab that you can just ask your question there, and then I will be monitoring the questions. I'll be monitoring the chat. If you guys have something that you want to just say as a chat, you want to comment on something, you like something, or you want to disagree with something, you can put that in the chat, and then I'll be monitoring that as well. And then this session will be about 45 minutes long. Bob has a presentation that'll go about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have the last 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So if you guys have whatever questions you throw there in the Q&A, I will do my best to try to summarize them and shoot that over to Bob. But let's get started. Let me introduce him real quickly. So first of all, I am so thrilled and honored to welcome Bob Dotson to our pro speaker session today. His long-running series, The American Story, was a regular feature on the NBC Today Show for 40 years. He is now a New York Times best-selling author and writes a daily blog, which the Society of Professional Journalists cites as the best in new media. Bob crisscrosses America, searching for people who are practically invisible, the ones who change our lives but don't take the time to tweet and tell us all about what they're doing, right? His 4 million mile quest has gotten noticed because he is one of the most honored storytellers of our time. Bob has earned he's earned 120 national awards for his producing and on-air reporting, and they include 8 national Emmys and 6 Edward R. Murrow Awards for Best Network News Writing, which is a record. Bob continues to produce programs that have won 7 international film festivals and documentary's highest honor, the Cine Grand Prize. His work has received top honors at the Kennedy Center, DuPont Columbia, and the William Allen White Foundation for Journalistic Excellence. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to our speaker for today, Bob Dotson. Take it away, Bob.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to meet that guy you're talking about. I'm not sure Any rate, folks, I was sitting in the seats that you're sitting in today a lifetime ago, and I was wondering how I could have somebody spend enough money to let me go all around the world and have fun doing stories. And it struck me that storytelling hasn't changed since the cavemen days. I mean, you went down in the valley and you saw somebody hit a dinosaur over the head, and then you went back to the cave and you started painting a picture and you said, boy, that sucker was big. And there was a reason that one cave was full and the other one's not so full, because they were better storytellers. Now, all of the cutting edge technology that I learned when I was your age is now in a museum. Film cameras, splicers, glue, it was all cutting edge stuff. But the stuff that hasn't changed is how to tell a visual story well. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to give you some tips that you can get running right away and use and do a better job. And it doesn't make any difference if you're doing an hour documentary or a 16-second video. I mean, some days you do oil paintings and some days you do watercolors, but it's the same story. So here are the tips. First of all, what you need to do is not tell us what your story is going to be about. Assume that no one cares. And that way, you'll start to find the building blocks to build to the point of your story. Not just what your story is about, but where are you going with it? And that is the key to storytelling. So for instance, I wanted to do a story a little while back on crowdfunding. And I figured, well, how could I do this differently? Everybody else would just find somebody who had used the crowdfunding in order to raise money to solve some problem in their lives or the lives of their neighbors. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if I could find somebody who didn't need crowdfunding because they solved the problem themselves? So I sat for a while and I said, all right, what's the focus of my story? Not exactly what my story is about, which is crowdfunding, but what's the focus? And I finally came up with some things can't be donated. Then I went out to see if I could find a strong central character, somebody to help me get from the beginning of my story to the end. And I found a great kid. He was in high school and he wanted to conduct the Boston Pops Orchestra. Now, okay, he's a high school kid. How do you get to the point that you're able to conduct the Boston Pops? Well, let me show you a story just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that I do. And we'll talk about that on the other end. This is a story about a boy who decided, maybe I can make this happen and I don't have to just ask a bunch of strangers to fund my quest.
An 18-year-old from Goose Creek, South Carolina,
had a dream that seemed impossibly out of his grasp. But when the Boston Pops came to his home state Tuesday night, it actually came true. NBC's Bob Dotson has that story.
Braden Kirschner likes to conduct music with his eyes closed so he can see his dream. He wants to join John Williams and Arthur Fiedler and Keith Lockhart, the select few who have conducted the Boston Pops.
What do you and Keith Lockhart have in common?
Both young and handsome.
And he's more confident than I am.
Never mind that Braden is just 18. To prepare for a career in conducting, he's learning to play every instrument in the orchestra. 12 so far.
If I gave you orders and I didn't play your instrument, you wouldn't take that order as seriously. No, 1, 2, 3, 1.
Okay.
The friends Braden tutors in Goose Creek, South Carolina know he's serious.
Good, but when you do it, don't go. Just go.
While they hung out last summer, doing what teenagers do, he worked 11 jobs.
I have it planned out. See?
He told his mom, Diane, he needed $10,000
Which I will do
fast.
It was a little shock to me because at that time I just lost my job.
The boy with a dream had seen an ad on the internet saying fans could conduct the Boston Pops if they donated big bucks to the orchestra.
It's just money. And if that can buy you the thing that you wanted all your life, then it's worth it to me.
Braden could have had a fundraiser to get the cash. He did not. Instead, he mowed most of the yards in the neighborhood.
worked the overnight shift at the Waffle House, delivered newspapers and pizzas. 6 months later, he had $5,000, half the money he needed.
There were a lot of people talking behind the scenes that when the time came, we would make sure he got there.
Please welcome in his Boston Pops conducting debut, Braden Kirschner.
Turns out that $5,000 was enough. Last night, the Pops performed in South Carolina, just down the road from Goose Creek, with a new guest conductor. Standing on that stage, Braden tallied up what his dream had cost.
All the hundreds of yards I mowed and the hundreds of cars I washed and all the late night jobs.
Is the bill a bargain?
I could buy a new car, but it would rust and break down in 20 years. And then this is something that I'll always have with me.
Oh, he'll have something more than a memory. The Pops return Braden's money to help him pay for college. Some things aren't bought. They're earned.
My heart jumped out of my chest. It was the coolest thing I've ever experienced.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, Goose Creek, South Carolina.
I wish I could do it again.
What a great story. Bob, thank you.
Well, here's the deal. We had one camera to shoot that entire story, but we started thinking about the building blocks we might need to tell the story. So I said to a friend of mine, listen, if you stand in the back and shoot the wide picture, I will give you all the video we have from up close, because the conductor, the normal conductor of the Boston Pops, said, listen, of course, the people who play in this orchestra know how to do the Stars and Stripes. But if they realize that Braden knows how to actually conduct, they'll start following him. So you want to have your camera on his face. We couldn't leave. But how do you get all the close-ups that you might need? Because, you know, during the actual performance, you can't wander around the stage. We went to the rehearsal. And I asked the band director, I said, what will you be playing that has the same tempo as what he will be conducting? And then we shot all the extreme close-ups of the people in the orchestra playing the various instruments. And that's how we did it. We shot that in 4 hours, which included a little time at his hometown, and then zipped in to do the thing at night. And then we edited it a couple of hours and off we went. So it's the same kind of deadline that you've been facing here, you know, during the convention and maybe during your actual work time. But the question is, what building blocks do you need to get to the point of your story? And the point of the story, as you remember, was some things aren't bought. I mean, some things aren't donated. You have to buy them, and by doing things yourself that help to make sure that you get what you want. So let me give you some tips. Tips number one, a lot of people talk about when they do stories, who, what is the story about? When did it happen? Where is it? And why? Who, what, when, where, why? You'll hear that 1,000 times if you go into journalism. But most stories are developed that way. Here's a tip that'll do a little bit different. First thing you do is, hey, you get their attention. So when you look at the building blocks you've gathered, or when you're thinking about what you might want to shoot, you say, all right, what do I assume will get their attention? And that's what I start with. Regardless of what I think I want to do, get the thing that grabs their attention. Secondly, after the hey, is this story is about you. Hey, you. This might be a story in Topeka, Kansas, but this is why you care in Hawaii. All news, all storytelling is local. So you need to find some element, some building block that connects it to a wide audience. You know, kind of like universal buttons. Does it make them happy? Does it make them sad? Is it something that brings a memory? After you've engaged them with the hey, immediately say this story, it might be about some kid down in South Carolina conducting, but it's really about you, your dream. So hey, you. The third building block is see. So see what I found. And a storyteller's job is to connect the seemingly unconnected, because as you all know today, most of us, our problem is not to find information or visuals or pictures. It's all over the internet. People have probably seen it 1,000 times, but they'll keep coming back to you as a storyteller because you connect them in a different way than other people. And I think a good working definition of anybody who's a storyteller is someone who will show you and tell you things you might miss, even had you been there standing next to them. So, hey, you get their attention. This is really about you, the audience. See, this is the way I've connected the dots on this. And so why should you care? You know, when people talk about watching television or a movie, they say, I'm spending time tonight watching this. The operative word there is spending. So people will, if they want to give you a half hour or 10 minutes or 13 seconds on the internet, they're spending their time. So you must wrap it up. You must tell them why you need that, because people want two things out of your storytelling. They want to have understanding, context, what's this about? And also they want the information given to them in such a way that it is presented in an engaging, if not entertaining way. So you have to entertain them, engage them, and you also have to give them some context. Well, how do you find information that no one else has? Here's the second tip. Did you notice that people always answer your questions when you talk to them in three parts? They give you the answer they think you've asked for, and then they explain their answer. And if you wait just a beat before jumping in with another question, they get a little uneasy because people don't like silence. And if they get silence from you after the answer, the explanation, and then a little bit of silence, where they jump in with something because they want to make sure that you understand. So they go, well, dumb it, that's why I killed my wife. Well, you might have just shown up to do a basketball story, and now you got a murderer. I learned this from all my in-laws are cops, detectives, highway patrol, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, FBI. I'm the only guy. At Christmas time, I would take out my reporter's notebook, and when they put their guns in a gun safe, I put my reporter's notebook in the gun safe because I figured they're onto something there. But they always said, you ever watch these detective shows on TV? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, when they're talking to a suspect, if the suspect talks first, he'll fill the silence. So we don't ask all that many questions. And I said, well, this is something I can do. I can ask questions in such a way that if they fill the silence, they'll give me information that I don't know them well enough to ask about. And that either gives me something really interesting I can put in my video, or gives me some more deep way of assessing a story. Because, the biggest problem, you've seen it all the time on the internet, is somebody gives you the headline, and then they repeat the headline, and then they go get a reaction to the headline, and then they end up with the headline again. So they really haven't moved it off the mark. But you want to go a little deeper. Well, the rule of threes: the question, the explanation, the silence, and then the tighter answer will give you a way to get into the story. The second part of that is that people like you to show up and not ask questions. And sometimes the question that's not a question will get you a lot more information. And I'll give you one quick example. I was out covering a story about a guy whose father was sick, and he was back home and he was dying, and he was the Shah of Iran, like the king of Iran. And his son was out at an Air Force base being trained. So everyone stood around trying to get, a reaction from him, and they had him sequestered in a home. So we all kind of stood around there for 30, 40 minutes, and we decided we'd go in and get coffee, and we left, each one of us, the reporters, we had a camera person there. So they were all trained at the house, and if the person showed up, where they'd get a picture of him. When I came back, the fellow that I was working with, Scotty Burner, said, well, I got the Shah of Iran's son. I got a reaction. I've got it fed. It's already up in New York. And everybody wants to interview me because I'm the only person that's met him. And I said, wait a minute, you're standing here with 20 people. How did you meet him and get what you needed? He said, well, I asked a question that's not a question. I said, how's that? And he said, well, I had my camera trained towards the house, but that, he never shows up. So I looked the other way, and I saw this young man walking down the street who looked like he didn't grow up in Lubbock, Texas. So I quietly took my camera off the tripod and I walked down the street. I didn't walk up to him and say, hey, I'm Scotty Berner. I'm a network guy and I want to know if you're the Shaw of Iran's kid. And if you are, how do you feel? Instead, I noticed that he was looking at flowers along the way and I said, those are beautiful chrysanthemums. And the young man started talking flowers. And then I said, my dad loved flowers. See what he was doing? He was slowly getting the conversation over to fathers. And the young man said, well, my father loved them too, loved tulips. And then Scotty said, my dad died last year and I miss him, which is a true story. And the young guy goes, well, my dad is sick. Soundbite, 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 soundbite. He said, I still wasn't sure that this was the Shah of Iran's son, but by this time, the guards up at the house saw this young man, started running down the street, and I didn't turn around and start arguing my Second Amendment freedoms. I mean, my First Amendment freedoms with guys who were carrying their Second Amendment, the guns. He says, I just turned around and shot the other pictures I needed, and when he went walking up the driveway, I said, hey, is that the Shah of Iran's son? And the guy said, yeah. So I went right over and fed it up on my computer. And by this time, everybody else came running down the street and said, what was that? And I said, well, that was the Shah of Iran's son, but he was coming from a different direction. So you got the rule of threes, you got the question that's not a question, and you've got fill the silence. All three of those will get you jump-started on your story. Here's the second tip, the third tip. You take one great soundbite out of that rule of silence, fill the silence, and you use that in your story. But you probably have two or three really interesting points that, you just don't have time to fit into all those sound bites. But you take one of them, you put them into your own words, and that's your opening line. Kind of like with that story, he kept his eyes closed so he could see his dreams. Well, he had said that in an interview, but he didn't say it like I wrote it. I tightened it up because I'm a writer. But the idea was there, so you're able to then find the opening of your story a whole lot quicker. Do you sit around and, that's the hardest part sometimes. So the other thing too, because we're not in a linear situation these days, always write the middle of your story first. Don't worry about the opening line, because that's the toughest part. But if you work on the, hey, you see, if you work on the see part, you're basically going through that notepad in your head and you're saying, oh, this is important, and this is important. This is how I'm going to connect it. But while you're doing that, you might find that perfect opening line where somebody filled the silence and gave you a little more in-depth thought about what the story was about. So that's the quickest way to do it. Now, the only reason we tell anybody anything is to elicit a response. And that's why you need to do more than just show or tell. You already know this. What you want is the viewers of your storytelling to have an experience. And so in the best of all situations, you're not showing them anything or telling them something. You're letting them be a part of the action that you saw and loved. So you try to figure out how to do the explosion, or how to do the, to get them so they can experience it. Well, you anticipate emotion. There was a fellow who went down and covered a grain elevator explosion with one camera. And he said, when I showed up, he said, listen, I've got a 28-second shot for your minute 10 story, and it's all there. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, there was a father and a son, and they were waiting to see if the second son in the family was going to come out alive. And so instead of just waving my camera around and shooting a bunch of stuff after I shot 2 or 3 shots of the scene, I just focused on those two faces, because the father had been overwhelmed. He was looking away from the grain elevator. The son was still looking to see if his brother was coming out. And all of a sudden, his brother, started to blossom. And then a tear started coming down his face. He says, so I could have whipped around to see what he saw, but I wouldn't know what he was looking at anyway. So I stayed with him on the tear. And about this time, the father figures out that something's going on. So he turned around. Now he's looking off camera. And all I did was take 2 steps over their shoulder, because now I can see what they were looking at. And here came the other brother out of the dust. He anticipated the emotion. and didn't wave his camera all over the place and got it beautifully in about 28 seconds. So I could do a 54-second story for NBC Nightly News. It had a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and an emotional sting because you didn't know whether the brother was going to come out, but you could watch the tears, so something was going on. So it built to the point of the story, which is he alive or is he dead? And otherwise, it's just a headline. Boy, there's a big elevator explosion in Houston today, and a lot of people were missing. Boom, where do you go from there? Well, if you get to know this particular family, you can do it very, very effectively and grab people, and they're going to want to find out what happened. So where do you find these stories? Well, don't always stay with the pack. I was on a day 3 tornado, and the only reason we were there was because the governor was going to fly in to say, I think I'm going to ask for federal assistance. All the reporters chased after the governor. And I shot a few pictures of the governor just to say he was there, and then I could mention what he said. But instead, I followed a guy with bib overalls because he was interesting and he was fun. And he talked to me as if the camera wasn't even there. So I followed him along. I didn't ask him what he was looking for, because like I say, it was day 3. It's not like it's, And he finally finds this big pile of stuff, and he reaches into it, and he's so comfortable with my camera that he looks right into the lens, and he pulls up this big hunk of pink goo, and he said, well, that tornado got my false teeth. But it didn't get me. So I thought, do I start with that because it's funny? No, because they don't know him yet. Like in a good joke, you need a setup. But I had a little natural sound from the guy talking to me as we went along looking for something, and he was on a quest. The audience is going to want to go on that quest, no matter how long it might be or short, because they want to find out what he's going to find. And then when he does that great punchline, it really works. So I got more response out of that 45-second story than anything else I had done up to that point. And I was a young guy when I first started it. So the storyteller's job is to try to see beyond the normal. And to do that, you open your eyes and all of your senses, not just your writing and not just your pictures, because the building blocks consist of writing, sound bites, in other words, quotes that you might get. Very important. Most people today don't realize this. Natural sound. If you are standing next to the river and you let them hear the river for a while, they can see and hear how fast it's going. So you're setting the stage so they can experience. And that's very important when you want to build an emotional outline up to the point of your story. So how do you attract a larger audience than just your classmates? Well, do it like your 2-year-old sister. Anytime you walk in the room and tell her something, she says, why? 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 Well, that's the most important question. So curiosity will get you a better story. Secondly, you need to get out of your comfort level. And to do that, don't just do the kinds of things that all of your buddies are shooting. Try to figure some place and some group of people who don't normally get into your stories. Seemingly ordinary people do extraordinary things. And if they themselves, kind of like the guy, looking for his false teeth, if they're interesting and engaging, people will want to go along with them. So they'll help you, they'll carry your audience from the first image that you have to the very end. Now, the most important part of this whole process is editing. So many times we've done a good job of going out and we've got a lot of information, we've got a lot of video, and our stories start to fall apart because we try to jam it in. We got it all, so let's put it all in there. But you remember, you have to assume that nobody cares about your story until you make them care. So if you're going to take all the things that you bought today and jam it into your closet, it's just going to be crowded and messy. But instead you say, okay, what 5 hangers do I really need? And then start putting your clothes on it and say, okay, if you do that, then it's logical to go and get to the end of the story. So I think we have a question. If someone wants to ask a question, why, that'll be great.
Does anybody have any questions? If you have one, put that in the chat. I know that you don't have access to be able to, say it via audio, but if you have a question, throw it in the chat and then we can answer it for you. So Bob, it's about 9:30 or
okay,
11:30. I keep saying
I got it.
So we still got 15 more minutes, but if there's
Okay.
any, I do see one question. Hold on. It says, what's your favorite story that you have covered? Any favorite story? You've covered thousands of them. I don't know. Is it possible to get one?
My favorite story is always the next one. And I know that's kind of a cop-out, but it's absolutely true. As a storyteller, you don't ever retire, not really, because stories are all around you. Like for instance, I would have shot this story had I had a camera, but I was too busy doing the story. We had a guy that worked in our house redoing a room, and he happened to mention the fact that he had a girlfriend that he met online halfway around the world. And they'd only, that was 7.5 years ago. And for the last 3 years, they've been trying to get married. She lived in Hong Kong and he lived in South Carolina. So eventually, pandemic came, that was a problem. She got a job at Air Emirates, even though she was an accountant, because she figured then she could get free tickets and they could at least meet around the world somewhere. Well, last Christmas, he calls giggling, and he's gone over and picked her up. And they were coming, she finally had gotten clearance to get married, but they had to get married in 90 days, but they couldn't go to the Philippines where her parents lived. They couldn't go to Pennsylvania where his parents, so they were just going to go down to the Justice of the Peace. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going on the internet and getting a church of what's happening now, and you can do that on the internet. And so I became the preacher. My wife put up a Valentine, and last weekend we married these two people. And we put a Zoom call in, and they had 60 people from the Philippines and some of their flight crews all over the world, and then his parents and all that. And so they're all watching in. Then it turns out one of her sisters back in the Philippines is a professional singer. She's singing as she walks into the living room, and I'm taking my camera to get a shot of the guy, because I wanted to see the reaction on his face first, and then I just panned over, and here she came in her wedding dress, which she'd gotten on Amazon. I mean, it's a great story. So yes, I mean, there's millions of stories that were my favorites. Like for instance, the guy that was the beginning of Make-A-Wish Foundation was actually a beat cop in Philadelphia who had never he was 45 years old and he'd never gotten a minute's worth of overtime, because as it turns out, in the evening, he was answering dreams of little kids who were in a hospital that had cancer. So if somebody wanted to meet Batman, he'd go home and somebody on his block would make a Batman costume, and then he'd come back with somebody who looked like Batman, and then somebody else he took out to do a snowball fight because they never had one. And he was the first person to ever take somebody to Disney World with those kinds of things. And yet nobody wanted me to do this story because they said, well, especially him, because he says, right now I can handle all of the dreams of the kids that I know, but I'm not the American Cancer Society. So what would happen if I'm not around and to handle it? So I finally convinced him. I said, there's a lot of people out there that have good intentions or they don't see themselves on television. And so I did it. And years later, the little girl that he took to Disney World, turns out she did not die. And she came back, she was in her 30s. She had a little girl who was exactly the same age. And I did a follow-up story. I mean, that's what I've done all my life, is to take seemingly ordinary people who have done something significant. And because of that, when I look back, I don't look at the celebrity mirror that reflects celebrity and politicians and sports. I look in the shadows behind that media mirror that we all watch every day to see who's in the shadows who is doing something really significant that ought to have a day in the sunshine so that other people can figure out, well, maybe I can do something as well.
So, and I think that kind of answers, we have quite a few questions that came in, but Sinead had asked, what is the key to finding out what is the key to finding out of the ordinary and engaging stories? And I think you kind of answered that with, looking in the shadows and trying to, find other people.
Yeah. And I don't want to, I can't stress it enough to make sure that you get out of your comfort level and go talk to people you wouldn't normally talk to. So for instance, like if you're going someplace in Thanksgiving after the pandemic and you're sitting in a center seat on an airplane, if you just halfway look at somebody, don't they tell you everything they ever heard of? So if you could guide that with a question that's not a question, you could suddenly come up with a really good story or a really good person to put into your story. So that's what I do all the time. I try to be a good listener and then figure out how does that fit into what I had in mind.
Okay. Another question that has come up is that, today students are going to be out there producing a story on a given topic that they won't know until the contest starts. And they're going to have to go and talk to people and, people that they don't know. And oftentimes people don't want to talk. So how do you deal with, people not wanting to talk when you go up to them and you ask them, hey, can I ask you a few questions? Or, how do you approach people that you don't know?
Well, I found that people will help you more times than not if you don't lead with a problem. So, or your credentials. Here I am, and I'm under a deadline, and I'm a junior, and I've got 7 questions. Can you just answer 6 of them at least? Instead, I try to get them talking about, here I am, and can you help me? And this is what I need to do. And so you don't come on too hard. You just have a conversation for a second. You figure out what they're interested in. So for instance, if you walked into a kitchen and they're all cooking, don't start talking about what you need in 3 seconds. Talk about the fact that you love cheeseburgers and always have loved cheeseburgers. It always reminds you of your mother. Boom. Well, suddenly they're talking cheeseburgers. And then in a minute you say, well, listen, I have 2 more questions because I've got to do this thing, and they're into it. And so I think that's important. I mean, when I first started in television, I called up my grandmother and I said, did you see that story? And she said, yeah. And I said, what do you think? Because she had never seen me on television before. And she said, I think you ought to let her trade. I said, a trade? She said, yeah, because they're not going to keep paying you for 3 minutes work a day. So that's the sort of thing. In other words, if you have something where you can put people at ease first and not present what you need to get done, then also make yourself as a kind of person who needs help, that you're not the smartest person in the room. Well, they'll help you. I mean, and so I think that that's your best approach. I've used it for years, and more times than not, people will come to the point where they'll help me.
Okay, another question we have is where, a lot of students are going to be working on teams today. And, when you do your stories, oftentimes you're probably with a photographer and you're the reporter. What's the best way to work together to get the story done? Any tips for teamwork?
Yes, think of it as a jazz ensemble. And so somebody, is recording sound, somebody's doing pictures, somebody's producing, however large or small your group is. But the point is that if somebody's climbed to the top of the mountain to get a little shot, by God, you better use it. See what I mean? So everybody has a little riff. I mean, you're all playing the same music, but if you listen to a good piece of jazz, well, they all riff. Everybody gets their time in the sun. So I try to set my ego aside. This is not my story. This is our story. And anybody that's got an idea eventually is going to save the piece, because nobody's going to say, well, the picture just didn't quite work. They're just going to say, it's not something I want to watch. So what you want to do is make everybody around you as best as they can be. And sometimes that means having to swallow your own pride and figure out that I'll be happy with a B+ story and not A-, because that way I get a chance to use all the material that everybody came up with. And if you're the person producing it, or you're trying to finally put it all together, you want to make sure that everybody who gave a really strong effort gets a chance to have their piece of the minute in the light.
Okay. Another question. What's your biggest, I didn't expect that to happen, moment?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. That's a great question. I think my biggest moment. I had polio when I was a kid, and I couldn't get out of bed when I was 2, and it took me until I was probably in 3rd grade that I couldn't be on teams. I couldn't do this, couldn't do that. And the Today Show assigned me to do a story on the official photographer of the Statue of Liberty while they were restoring it just before the bicentennial. And so I climbed to the top of the Statue of Liberty on the outside at sunrise and had my picture taken, did the on-camera thing, sitting on the Statue of Liberty's big toe. And it's about the size of your couch at home. And so I sat there and kind of slapped my head 3 or 4 times saying, of all the stories and of all the places I would go, the chance that that he, first of all, he climbed all over the place. So he had ladders and things that are not normally up during the normal times. So to be on the Statue of Liberty's big toe at sunrise, doing a story was probably the biggest wow moment of my life.
That's pretty incredible. I hope you have a photo of that somewhere.
I do. I'll take a picture of it and send it to you.
Okay. Another question is, how do you deal with someone who clearly isn't comfortable talking when you go up and you want to interview them and ask them some questions? How do you deal with someone who's really shy? Are there any tips with getting them to open up?
Well, there's two parts of your story. One is you're going to take some bunch of pictures to go with your story, and the other part of it, you might ask some questions, right? So if a person is shy, then shoot all the video that doesn't require them first, and let them be kind of like your assistant director. I don't mean you're asking them questions to help you, but let them poke along. So they'll find out that through the process of you doing the rest of your story that you're not intimidating. And then you can turn around and start using that question that's not a question and fill the silence and all that sort of stuff. And pretty soon they're starting to tell you things that they didn't know that I've had a number of people say, when's the interview? And I said, well, you've been doing it. Because I don't make a big deal about my camera or where it is, or even if something messes up, I don't say, oh my gosh, the mic fell off. I just put it back on and then bring the questions back around. But mostly I try to get them so they feel like that they're into the story without actually being questioned right at the top.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but we do have a couple more questions. Is there any major tip that you'd like to give to students that are competing today that have to tell some sort of a story? Is there any one thing that they can, besides some of the other things that you've talked about, is there anything else that they could do that can help them today?
Well, think of your story assignment or opportunity as a chess game. Probably watched the Queen's Gambit or heard about it just recently. What you try to do is anticipate and be 2 or 3 steps ahead so that if something doesn't work out, the person doesn't want to talk to you, the sun doesn't come up, whatever, that you're already thinking plan B. I play the game from the very first moment that I get a story. If I had to stop right now, what's my final shot? What's the point of my story? Do I have it? And so that makes me much more efficient because there's 1,000 things you might get. But if you have to assume right now that you're over and done, what do you need? And so even though you might have all the rest of the day to do it, what that makes you is much more efficient.
Absolutely. Having a plan B for today is a great tip. We will have, let me see, I got one more question and then we're going to have to end. We need to end by 9. Well, I keep saying 9, but 9:45, 11:45 Pacific. Is there any tips or tricks to make a very dull or boring topic interesting or appealing to the audience?
Yeah, forget about the technology and figure out if you can find somebody who is interesting and fun to be with and use them as your strong central character. For instance, I had to do a really boring story about the price of meat going up. So I went down to this meat store, and I found this guy, and I said, how much pizza could I buy for $5 10 years ago? Meat pizza. And he brought out a big pie. And I said, okay, now 3 years ago, how much for $5 buy? And by the time I got down to today, because the price had gone up, it was like the size of a piece of fudge. Well, suddenly it was so much more interesting. I wasn't spinning off a bunch of numbers. And this guy, kind of like the guy looking for his false teeth, was fun and interesting. So he carried it along because he would make little snarky comments as we were going. But basically we started with a huge pie for $5, and we got down to this for today, made his point in 45 seconds.
Yeah, having an interesting central character is really important to help tell that story.
Yeah.
All right. We are just about out of time. If you want to hear more of Bob, he was on our STN podcast in January. So Bob and I had a wonderful conversation. If you want to hear more of some of his about his life and his really interesting career, check out the podcast. And then we have recorded this session. So if you want to, watch it again, I know there are some things that people might have missed. We're going to have this up on the website after the convention. But we just really want to thank you, Bob, for your time today and for spreading this gospel of storytelling with all of our storytellers today. So thank you so much for coming, and for all the attendees. Thank you guys for joining the session, and enjoy the rest of your conference, everybody, or convention. And we want to thank Bob once again. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
All right, let me leave you with one little thought to take off in your career. Success is not a question of being dealt a good hand. It's playing a bad hand well, over and over and over again. Have a good life.
That's awesome. That's also the name of our podcast in January. I used that for the name. I thought that was wonderful. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your convention, and that'll do it for Bob's session today.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks so much, Bob. We really, really appreciate it.
Okay, Kevin, thanks. Have a good convention.
Yeah, happy Valentine's. Hope you and the family are safe. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
All right.